of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kriti Gupta, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, a day of fireworks on the Hill.
There has been no detectable increase in the aggregate price level as a result of tariffs.
You know,
there have
Dr.
been relative
Miran,
price changes,
you have made
are.
clear that you will do or say whatever Donald Trump wants you to do or say. And that may work in a political position, but it takes an axe to Fed independence and will make life far more expensive for American families.
First, the confirmation hearing of Stephen Miran to join the Fed, marking the president's first big step in remaking the Federal Reserve. Plus, what we learned of the new DOJ investigation into Fed Governor Lisa Cook over mortgage fraud allegations. And now a major report dropping this hour pointing to similar allegations involving members of President Trump's own team.
And as the Miran hearings played out in the Senate Banking Committee, over the Senate Finance Committee, a tense scene playing out.
All over the country, Mr. Secretary, scientists and doctors are saying otherwise. They're all wrong, too. They're all lying, according to you.
The scientists and doctors that are supporting me all over the country.
The public has seen measles outbreaks, leadership in the National Institute of Health questioning the use of mRNA vaccines, the recently confirmed director of Centers for Disease Control and Prevention fired. Americans don't know who to rely on.
You're a charlatan. That's what you are. You're the ones who conflate chronic disease with the need for vaccines.
The aggressive back and forth between senators on both sides of the aisle and HHS Secretary RFK Jr. as questions swirled around his role in the chaos seen at the agency, the CDC, and the American public health system. We'll speak to a senator who cross-examined both RFK Jr. and Stephen Miran today when Senator Mark Warner of Virginia joins us up ahead.
And some of the biggest names in tech descend on Washington, from Meta's Mark Zuckerberg and Apple's Tim Cook to Microsoft's Satya Nadella, the AI event they attended with the First Lady. Their plans to meet with the president just a short time from now. And what, if any, news could come out of all of that? It's all up ahead. But we begin on Capitol Hill this evening, and what we learned from Stephen Miran as he seeks to serve out a months-long post at the central bank, addressing lawmakers' concerns today, in some cases, over the long-term independence of the Fed.
Look, the president nominated me because I have policy views that I suppose that he liked. If I'm confirmed to this role, I will act independently, as the Federal Reserve always does, based on my own personal analysis of economic data, my own personal analysis of the effects of economic policies upon the economy, and act based on my judgment of the best economic policy possible.
Joining us with the latest here in our Washington studios, Bloomberg's Mike McKee, who was on the Hill for Stephen Miran's hearing, back with us now in the Bloomberg Bureau. It's great to have you in town for this, Michael. That was one answer that he had prepared for lawmakers. There were also a number of questions he chose not to answer today.
There were a number of questions he chose not to answer because if you work for Donald Trump, you're not allowed to answer certain questions. Elizabeth Warren asked him who won the 2020 election, and of course, he refused to answer that. The biggest thing with Stephen Miran is he's talking about he'll be independent and use his own analysis. But the reason he was chosen is because his analysis matches what Donald Trump wants. So he'll be a reliable vote for a rate cut, which is why the president is putting him in there. What may be a little bit more scandalous to everybody is he admitted today that he's not going to resign as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. He's going to take unpaid leave, which would mean that for the months he is at the Fed, he is still an employee of Donald Trump. And if he wants to go back to the CEA, obviously, and this was brought up by several members questioning him, he's going to have to be nice to Donald Trump if he wants his old job back. So is there really any independence here is the question.
Well, as we digest the hearing of Stephen Miran and what may come ahead, we also have one eye on Lisa Cook and the legal proceedings there as well. Donald Trump very clearly making accusations of mortgage fraud, TBD if that actually shows up. A report from ProPublica really just in the last hour now showing a record or investigation that 3 of his cabinet members may have mortgage fraud. Just walk us through the story. What do we know?
Well, according to ProPublica, Sean Duffy and Lee Zeldin and Lori Chavez DeRaymer, the labor secretary, all have more than one primary residence mortgage. And that is the same thing that they are accusing the Lisa Cook with. And the thing is we don't know in any of these cases, and we don't know in Lisa Cook's case, whether or not any crime was committed, whether there was anything wrong. Because it is possible, and the White House offered this as a defense to ProPublica, that the banks can grant waivers for this, and perhaps they did. And of course, these are all people who work in Washington and have to have a residence back in their districts or wherever. Mm-hmm. And so it's natural that they would have two houses, perhaps. The question is, did they get a benefit out of that, and was something illegal? The Department of Justice announced today it is starting an investigation, a criminal investigation of Lisa Cook, and has sent out subpoenas. That'll probably take a while, but that's we expected that would happen, and we don't know if they're going to find anything that they could criminally charge her with.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike McKee walking us through first Stephen Miran and now the latest with Lisa Cook and potentially other cabinet members as well. Let's bring in someone into the conversation, someone who is familiar with the process we saw play out on Capitol Hill. We welcome to Bloomberg TV and Radio Lael Brainard, former vice chair of the Federal Reserve. Lael, a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We just got to ask, what is your initial reaction to the events of the day?
Well, we learned something really important today at the hearing, the idea that the Council of Economic Advisors, Stephen Miran, would go over to the Federal Reserve as a governor and remain on the payroll of the president of the White House. That's unprecedented. And of course, he said many times that he vowed to be an independent voice. But I think the members of the committee correctly really pressed him on how could he be an independent voice if he's still working for the president and may, in fact, go back to his old job in several months' time. So that was a very important piece of information. Of course, it comes in the context where the White House is mounting an unprecedented attack on the independence of the Federal Reserve more broadly, summarily firing a member of the board, pressuring the chair. So that was a very important hearing today.
Well, I'd love to just explore this a little bit with you, because the idea that he's going to still effectively be a White House employee in a political position, even though he will not be taking his pay. He was asked about this a couple of times, and Stephen Miran said that that was the advice of legal counsel. When asked if he would simply resign on his own, he didn't really answer that question. So it looks like this is happening, Lael Brainard, and if he is in fact confirmed, what will that arrangement mean for the Fed? We won't trust anything he says?
It's a really important unprecedented arrangement. We just haven't seen this. And of course, why does it matter that the Federal Reserve takes decisions based on analysis in a way that is independent of the White House? Because when the Federal Reserve is not independent, as we saw in the 1970s, inflation goes up and long-term interest rates go up, mortgages become more expensive. So it's very much in the interest of American consumers and the American economy to make sure that those members of the Federal Reserve can make their independent assessments. If you're on the payroll of the White House, it's really hard to see how you do that.
Would you not trust his word if he stayed?
Well, I think the question is whether, more broadly, the credibility of the Fed as an inflation-fighting institution would be really at stake here. And the question is, do the broader markets view the Fed as compromised?
We've seen snippets of that in the markets, but not a full-out panic just yet that we've seen in certain other iterations. Donald Trump used the word getting a majority on the Federal Reserve in a cabinet meeting. Walk us through just what the impact of that kind of framing has on the institution.
Well, of course, the Federal Reserve Board has 7 members, and so it requires 4 members to get a majority. And those votes that are taken on monetary policy help to determine interest rates. Of course, he said very clearly he'd like to see lower interest rates. Loads of presidents want to see lower interest rates, but getting a majority gets him in a position to affect that. And one of the things that I think has never been at issue before is that all of the other members of the Monetary Policy Setting Committee, all of the Reserve Bank presidents, are up for reappointment in February. And so having a majority on the board could actually affect the composition of the broader Monetary Policy Setting Committee. That would be another really serious threat to the independence.
You mentioned President Trump's efforts to fire one of the Fed governors, in this case, Lisa Cook, whose lawyer today, as we wait for a ruling from the court, her lawyer, Abby Lowell, was out with a statement saying the questions over how Governor Cook described her properties from time to time, which have started to address the pending case and will continue to do so, are not fraud. But it takes nothing for this DOJ to undertake a new politicized investigation. There's a criminal investigation now, which was a pretty important headline today. ProPublica is out with reporting that we talked about with Michael McKee, that 3 members at least of President Trump's cabinet are also facing allegations of mortgage fraud, if we want to call it that. In this case, 2 primary residences. You've been in Washington for a minute. This isn't unusual around here, is it?
No. I think what's important, though, is because of the independence of the Federal Reserve and the connection it has to having a strong economy with low inflation and low interest rates, that what matters here is making sure there's a really good process. As you know, the Federal Reserve board members are not supposed to be fired except for cause. And since that has never happened before, it seems like it would be extremely important for any White House, if they wanted to show that they cared about the Fed's credibility in fighting inflation, to go through a lengthy process before firing somebody and showing the cause. That hasn't happened here. And so it's that lack of due process, the urgency to fire a board member in order to secure the majority, that is so unusual and should have markets a bit rattled about whether the Fed can be independent.
Why do you think the markets aren't as rattled as maybe they have been in previous iterations?
Well, I think as we've seen in many examples around the world, often it takes a little while for market participants, investors, to digest just how significant they consider these moves to be. But when markets move, they do tend to move. And they may underreact for a while, but they can overreact at a point in time. And so it's not clear what it would take to see that kind of move. But of course, when the initial announcement of the firing was made, we did see the directional pattern that the dollar weakened and long-term interest rates went up. And so that does suggest that investors are watching this set of developments very carefully. And as we know, again, in the 1970s here in the U.S., as we saw in the U.K., markets will force long-term interest rates up if they believe that the central bank no longer has credibility on fighting inflation. You know,
whether it's Lisa Cook we're talking about or the commissioner of BLS, or now President Trump is asking the Supreme Court to let him fire the FTC commissioner. That is a headline from just a couple of hours ago this afternoon. What do you make of this broad attempt, the president, to reshape government in his own likeness?
Well, we certainly have seen across the independent agencies a very aggressive executive branch asserting the prerogative of getting rid of people who have terms that extend well into this president's term in office, asserting executive authority to do that. And it will be up to the Supreme Court to see exactly where they are going to draw the line. So far, they've been somewhat sympathetic to the president's overreach. And the other thing, of course, that will be important to see when this does, if this does go to the Supreme Court, is whether they again draw a distinction between other independent agencies and the Federal Reserve, because that will tell us a little bit about how they are likely to view the current fight at the Federal Reserve.
It's great to have you with us, and we appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
Lael Brainard, of course, the former vice chair of the Federal Reserve. We thank you for being with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, fireworks on Capitol Hill today as Health and Human Services Secretary RFK Jr. defends his new vaccine policies during a Senate committee hearing. But first, a look at where markets closed today. Our power moves coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kriti Gupta here in Washington as we turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. He's live at World Headquarters in New York. A busy after-hours session. Romaine, where should we start?
Well, I actually want to start during the cash session because it was a powerful day. We talk about an S&P 500 that looked like it had been kind of pinned in a tight trading range. It broke out of that range today to close at a record high, 65.02, and it's significant for several reasons. All 7 of the Mag 7 stocks rising today, led primarily by Amazon and Meta. That pushed that collective group to a record high as well. But there was a lot of activity in the chip space. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index rising 1%, and it didn't look like it was going to do that today. You flip up the board. Earlier in this session, Texas Instruments was under a lot of pressure. It was giving a presentation at a conference here in New York and seemed to suggest that the chip cycle was not recovering as fast as some people thought. Now, keep in mind, Texas Instruments makes kind of the analog chips, if you will, not those sort of high-powered chips that NVIDIA does, but they are in everything out there. Cars, all your appliances at home here. So there was a lot of concern. But then other executives started to take the stage, including Intel and a few others, and they talked about that continued CapEx spend, particularly when it comes to AI. Broadcom at the top of your screen there, rising about 1% in the cash session, rising even more in the after-hour session after reporting earnings, Joe. Earnings that were very encouraging here about some of those higher-end chips, about the demand and the appetite for it, and more importantly, just about the AI ecosystem overall, particularly here in the U.S. In fact, Trump earlier today addressing that, saying that he does actually see some of his policies, particularly tariffs, aiding that. And we should point out, we just learned a few minutes ago that Oracle, which has been a big beneficiary of the data center build-out, is now lining up financing, $38 billion in financing that's going to be led by J.P. Morgan to start building out those data centers in Wisconsin and Texas.
Romaine, that's the stock market. Talk to us about the bond market here. I mean, the U.S. Treasury, the 10-year, breaking that trading range it's been in. What's going on in the bond market?
Well, there was a lot of concern right now, Kriti, as you know, not so much about what happened today with Miran or maybe even what happened at the start of the week with the UK bond sell-off, but really about what happens tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. We get a jobs report, and a lot of people see it as critical, given that there has been so much evidence that there are cracks in the U.S. labor market. Jay Powell, of course, has made it clear that, based on his Jackson Hole speech, that he's a little bit more concerned about the labor market than inflation, which of course means that most people in this market are anticipating a rate cut on that September 16th, 17th meeting, just about a week and a half away. The big question, though, Kriti, is whether that rate cut is the start of an easing cycle. And a big determinant of that is going to be the health of the labor market. And at least based on some of the preliminary data we've gotten out of ADP, out of the jobless claims, et cetera, seem to suggest that there is some fraying around the edges. But we're going to find out for real tomorrow morning at 8:30 a.m.
Is Wall Street proven right? One data set, yay or nay. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, we thank you so much for walking us through the market moves from today. Right back to Capitol Hill, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. faced a Senate committee over the changes to his agency's vaccine policies.
I'm asking the questions for Mr. Kennedy on behalf of parents and schools and teachers all over the United States of America who deserve so much better than your leadership. That's what this conversation is about, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, they deserve the truth, and that's what we're going to give them for the first time in the history of that agency.
And I'm approaching this as a doctor, not as a senator. An email from a physician friend of mine. Hey, Bill, I'm not even sure what I'm asking you, but we're all confused and concerned about who can get the COVID vaccine. We are having our attorney try and render an opinion, but there's no firm guidance and concern about liability if vaccines are given to a patient who requests it, but not on the current CDC list. Pharmacists are requiring a prescription now even for patients over 65, creating a huge headache. I would say effectively we're denying people vaccine.
Senator Cantwell.
You're wrong.
Those exchanges between Democratic Senator Michael Bennet and Republican Senator Bill Cassidy, a medical doctor whose vote was critical to Secretary Kennedy's confirmation. Joining us now is Bloomberg Health reporter Jessica Nix, who joins us live from Capitol Hill. Jessica, there was a lot in that hearing. Just walk us through what stood out to you.
It was a lot. It was a very chaotic and tense meeting between Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and also all of the senators on both sides of the aisle. We saw some interesting back and forth between all of them. It was about a 3-hour-long meeting. There were some protesters that were escorted out in the beginning. But the main thing that kept coming up from the Democratic side was all of the chaotic stuff that Kennedy has done to the CDC and also vaccine policy over the past few months. On the Republican side, there were a few Republicans who showed some fractures in terms of whether they still support Kennedy, especially around Operation Warp Speed, which was obviously one of President Trump's top crowning achievements from his first administration. Republican senators saying that they really supported Operation Warp Speed and don't understand why Kennedy is no longer supporting mRNA vaccines through canceling various research grants and also pulling back on support and broad access for COVID vaccines.
So what comes from today, Jessica? Was this just a therapeutic exercise for Democrats to make a point, get the poison out, shine a light, whatever cliche you want to use, or will something actually change when it comes to policy, if not RFK Jr.'s own job?
That is, I think, the question of the day. On the Democratic side, there were a few people who were calling for his resignation. Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, has also said before in an op-ed that he wants Kennedy to resign. Raphael Warnock of Georgia also called for Kennedy to resign today. So on the Democratic side, that's what their ask is. On the Republican side, we don't really know where things are going to go from here. Bill Cassidy from Louisiana has said that he believes that Kennedy's recent actions around the CDC require oversight. But we still don't have any answer on what that means.
Bloomberg's Jessica Nix. We thank you so much for the reporting, Jessica, and good to have you in Washington for this. We have a lot more on that hearing coming up with someone who is also in the room. After the break, we'll be joined by Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, with much more to follow on a day that he, in fact, straddled multiple hearings. Creedy, he had a chance to talk to Stephen Miran, as well as RFK Jr. I'm not sure which one was more productive for the senator, but we'll find out.
Not to mention a series of national security news to really digest and to maybe act upon. He's the person who's closest to that story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Since we started this conversation as well, we got the ProPublica report that we were discussing with Lael Brainard, and I suspect that he's going to have some ideas about that. The conversation surrounding Lisa Cook and the ruling that we're hearing just took a very different turn.
Absolutely. And we know that in just the last 48 hours or so, Senator Tillis in North Carolina said he's not even going to talk about having a new nominee or even the discussion around the nominee as well. So there's lots going on there when it comes to just really where this conversation could go.
Well, that's true. And to bring you in the room, and I know a lot of folks were at work while this was happening, get a taste of this exchange, in this case between Stephen Miran and Democratic Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, on Miran keeping his current job as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. A different hearing we're talking about. Let's watch and listen.
I have received advice from counsel that what is required is an unpaid leave of absence from the Council of Economic Advisors. And so considering the term for which I'm being nominated is a little bit more than 4 months, that is what I will be taking. As long as that is the advice of counsel, I will follow the law.
Well, your independence has already been seriously compromised by your statement. You are going to be technically an employee of the President of the United States, but an independent member of the board of the Federal Reserve? That's ridiculous.
And again, we're going to have more on that hearing coming up with Senator Mark Warner, who was also part of the questioning for Stephen Miran. This is a very busy day in Washington with dueling hearings that took place this morning in the Senate. And in the case of RFK Jr., as we'll explore with the senator, things got very heated. There was some boiling over, if you will, as we saw a couple of moments ago between namely Democratic senators. But Republicans, in some cases on this panel, Creedy, were also very concerned about what they thought would be promises, in some cases, not kept from his confirmation process.
And the precedent that this really just sets for anyone who could potentially be even replacing Lisa Cook, is that someone that we need to be looking for within Donald Trump's own cabinet as yet another voice?
Yeah, that's for sure. We're going to have a lot to talk about with the senator from Virginia, so stay with us. You're dealing with somebody who straddles a number of committees, 2 of them in play today. Alongside Creedy Gupta, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being with us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. Lots happening in terms of what we heard on Capitol Hill today. Much more of the fireworks that played out right here in Washington when we convene our political panel. But first, Here are the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. Now, the president of Northwestern University, Michael Schill, resigned today following a 3-year tenure marked by controversy over protests on campus, a hazing scandal within the university's football program, and, of course, a public fight with the Trump administration over research funding. Schill, in a statement, said, quote, "Our community had made significant progress while simultaneously facing extraordinary challenges. An interim president will be named soon." Northwestern is in the middle of negotiations with the White House to release $790 million of funding currently frozen over allegations of anti-Semitism on campus.
Report out today underlining the precarious state of security funding for European nations as concerns grow over Russia's continued assault on Ukraine. With the Financial Times reporting the Trump administration plans on phasing out security assistance programs for European armies along Russia's border. The FT reporting, quote, Pentagon officials last week informed European diplomats that the U.S. would no longer fund programs that train and equip militaries in Eastern European countries that would be on the front line of any conflict with Russia, unquote. That news came same day the president and European leaders held a call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, with President Trump calling for Euro leaders to put economic pressure on China for funding Russia's war efforts, according to reports.
And some of the country's biggest tech leaders descended onto Washington today, with tech CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, Sam Altman, and on more for a series of events hosted by First Lady Melania Trump. The First Lady presiding over discussions centering around artificial intelligence, joined by administration officials with tech leaders in attendance. Now, the leaders are expected to stick around for a dinner event with the president at the newly paved Rose Garden. One notable absence from today's events: Tesla CEO and one-time Trump confidant, Elon Musk.
All right, we turn now to Capitol Hill after a banner day with both RFK Jr. and Stephen Miran on their respective hot seats, as we've been reporting over the course of this hour. And there was one Democratic senator who was there to cross-examine both of them. That would be, of course, Mark Warner of Virginia. As promised, he joins us now live from Capitol Hill. Senator, it's great to have you with us. It was quite a hearing we saw today on the Hill. If we can start with RFK Jr., at least I know you were in a couple of sessions here. Do you believe Americans are less safe today than they were before RFK was confirmed as health secretary?
Absolutely, yes. You know, this guy promised that he was going to follow science, not, you know, across the board fire experts. He's on them. It feels like a purge against any of the respected scientists. I was glad to see that my two Republican Senate colleagues, who are both doctors, spoke up. But it was amazing, Joe. I mean, like, I asked him how many people died from COVID. He didn't know. I asked him, did the vaccine that he had earlier complimented, saying President Trump should get a Nobel Prize for on Operation Warp Speed, he couldn't say whether that was actually had saved any lives. Other senators put up charts showing how many people used to die of polio and get mumps and other diseases that I know. You know, I was born in the 50s. They were still around that are now pretty much extinguished. But if we roll back on science, and it was astonishing. I think there was more than a few jaws that dropped with both his attitude and his willingness to kind of say he was going to create his own set of expertise. And, you know, and I believe that we could make people healthier. We've got way too many people who have got chronic illnesses, and that will require reworking. But it shouldn't mean moving away from vaccines, and it also shouldn't mean, one of the things he will never breathe a word about is, if we're going to stay healthy, we got to drink clean water and breathe clean air. Yet he doesn't raise any sound as all the environmental rollbacks. So it was a pretty astonishing session.
Senator Warner, where should the American people be getting their health guidance from? Is there an alternative here?
Well, traditionally, we should still be getting our health guidance from our doctors. But that first-time mom who maybe doesn't have a pediatrician yet, he totally trashed the Pediatrician Association today. I think it's scaring the dickens out of people. You know, we've got people that turn to AI now, which is not fully reliable, as we know. And now we have the United States of America that has always been the leader on health research, dramatically cutting back our health research. And Kennedy says he's not a doctor and don't take medical advice, yet where is he getting the advice to randomly fire and push out long-term scientists that have got a proven track record. I worry, and when you're already seeing, our health system with all its flaws, at least around research, at least around vaccines, was the world's leader. We've got the 3 Western states who are now trying to say they're going to set up their own system because they so worry that things like the CDC and the trusted groups who vet medicines, what could happen at the FDA, vet our food. It's a wild time.
Well, so what needs to happen here, Senator? Does RFK need to be fired? Because we heard from a lot of Republicans on your committee who have concerns about his views on vaccines and several other issues as well. Do you have critical mass on the committee to affect his job status?
I would hope the president would fire him. I've called for that before. I hope when he got in, I was going to be proven wrong, that he was going to keep his word, focus on science, but also try to take on the chronic illness plague that has hit our country. I got 2 kids that got in their 30s who are still got chronic illnesses. This is a real issue, but you got to base it in science. So what we've seen time and again is that you saw a couple senators speak up. There were another half dozen that I know that were aghast, Republican senators that were aghast. Will they move? Time will tell.
Senator Warner, you've had a busy day on Capitol Hill. This wasn't your only hearing. Let's talk about your other, specifically with Stephen Miran. Your colleague, Senator Warren, has called him a puppet for the president. Do you agree?
Listen, I was concerned with Mr. Miran. I don't know that much about him, but I was concerned, one, that he seems to want to take a leave of absence and still be an employee of the White House while you're at the Fed. That doesn't square with any notion of Fed independence. I also asked him whether he believed in, due process and presumption of innocence, because he would not speak up against these charges, and that's all they are, against Lisa Cook. And I didn't think, I expected this to happen, but it's already come out in the news media this afternoon that 3 of the Trump officials, a couple of them, I think, former members of Congress, have the same issue of claiming 2 primary residences. When you suddenly put the head of the FHFA in as your mortgage police, not the regulator, this is going to come back, and I think bite a number of members of Congress who rightfully or wrongfully did this same activity. Are they all going to get fired now as well? So I was disappointed with Mr.
That's a great question. Yes. Will that go before your committee, Senator? Mr. Pulte, by the way, says this is very much within his portfolio and within his authority, but that would also suggest criminal investigations for 3 members of the president's cabinet, right?
Right. And I would wonder, again, I'm lucky. I had financial success before I got into politics. The senator that lives the closest to the Capitol, I don't have to mandate 2 homes. But I think you will uncover a real hornet's nest here. And again, just the kind of hypocrisy that's coming out of the White House. Remember, the one thing about Donald Trump that has not been overturned, the verdict size, but the charge, felony charge, I believe it was, against Trump pumping up his own financial disclosures to look like he had more money than he had. Is that really a lesser crime than checking a couple of wrong boxes or even claiming 2 primary residences? I don't know, but there ought to be some level of equity in all of this, or fairness, which so far too often we all I constantly get depressed a bit that this sense of equal justice and this willingness to call out some of the abuses that are going on, people seem to get a little timid when they get in front of the camera.
Well, Senator Warner, naturally, all the concerns around Stephen Miran are certainly playing out in terms of what that precedent it sets when it comes to Lisa Cook's vacant seat, if indeed it is allowed to be filled. Your colleague, Senator Tillis from North Carolina, has suggested he won't even consider a replacement as long as she's in litigation. Is that enough to put the committee on ice?
Well, I would hope so, and I hope others would quietly send that signal as well. It's just, in America, we believe in due process and some presumption. And if we're going to, I have no idea what Ms. Cook did or didn't do, but it sure as heck seems, the president's got a goal, and that goal is to take control of the Fed and lower interest rates, kind of come hell or high water. And, you know, you guys are Bloomberg. I was a business guy longer than a politician. When you mess with the independence of the Fed, when you're willing to say we're going to dare the bond market to do something, we get in uncharted territory. And that ought to concern all of your viewers, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum.
Senator, I want to get to you from your perch on the Intel Committee, and of course you're vice chair of that committee, so I'm sure you've had your eyes on what was taking place in the South Caribbean. As the president said, we blew up a drug cartel boat that was smuggling drugs on the way to the United States, and they did provide video of this boat. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or YouTube, you can see this thing being literally blown out of the water and the individuals who are driving and riding on that boat before they are struck by what was presumably a missile or some sort of drone strike here. Senator, were you briefed on this action ahead of time?
No.
Have you heard from the administration? Can you confirm this was a cartel and that there were drugs on board?
I cannot. You know, let me be clear. The Maduro government in Venezuela is awful. And clearly we need to do all we can to eradicate the drug cartels. But to take this action, which at least at first blush seems to be counter to the law, international law of the sea, where you're, you know, even if it is an entity like this, you're supposed to give a warning shot. You're supposed to try to disable the ship. You don't blow it out of the water unless that ship is causing imminent danger to an American. That was not the case. But what worries the hell out of me on this is that there was another incident earlier this week where a far right-wing blogger, Laura Loomer, who is a 9/11 denier, is way out there, you know, interfered with my ability as vice chairman of the intelligence community to do my job in terms of doing oversight at the National Geospatial Agency. And she tweeted attacks against me, and DOD pulled my ability, which I've done dozens of times, to go out to this facility, visit it, do a town hall with the work staff there that I've done many times. They also happen to be constituents. It was in Springfield, Virginia. So if you've got this individual who also took out, and she's equal opportunity, she blasts Republicans as well as Democrats, but she took out and claimed to take out the NSA director, the first NSC director, Mike Waltz, took out and Gabbard, who I think, again, is not competent for the job, took away security clearances for 37 people, all at the behest of this non-official. And I raise it simply because if we are not, as congressional oversight, not going to get the ability to do oversight and get the briefings because people are afraid of being called out by Laura Loomer or the administration doesn't want to share information, then we are in a place that's frankly unprecedented.
You tweeted about this, writing on X just a short time ago, a couple hours before you stood in front of our camera, Senator. I actually don't know who's running this country's national security apparatus at the moment, which in itself is horrifying for the vice chair of the Intel Committee. Saying this, you go on to write the hapless and incompetent Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth, or the right-wing conspiracy theorist and 9/11 truther Laura Loomer. Sounds like the answer might be the latter, Senator.
Well, listen, I hope I'm wrong, but I'd love to see evidence that I'm wrong. Again, listeners, viewers,
is Laura Loomer the new Secretary of War?
Well, let's put it like this. She was so far out that everyone in the Republican circle said, do not give this person a job. She now seems to have more influence without any of the responsibilities of the job than anything I've seen in my lifetime. And again, this is a 9/11 denier. This is somebody who hangs out with white nationalists, is so anti-immigrant that it's kind of beyond the pale. And is she the one that's now calling the shots? I don't get it. And what I worry again about, if we don't know what happened in terms, and I think the military, God willing, will get this full brief on what happened with the Venezuela ship. But if you got to go through a Laura Loomer litmus test before you do your oversight job, then we got a heap of trouble.
Senator Warner, thank you so much for your time this evening. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, joining Balance of Power. Coming up on the program, more on today's hearings, plus details on major tech events happening tonight at the White House. This is one you don't want to miss. Stick with us. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Mr. Secretary, do you agree with me that the president deserves a Nobel Prize for Operation Warp Speed?
Yeah, absolutely, Senator. That was phenomenal.
Let me ask you, but you just told Senator Bennett that the COVID vaccine killed more people than COVID.
Wait,
that was a statement.
I did not say that.
Okay, then let me ask, because you also
Senator, I just want to make clear, I did not say that.
We'll check the record. That's a question of fact. It surprises me that you think so highly of Operation Warp Speed when, as an attorney, you attempted to restrict access.
That was Senator Bill Cassidy asking Secretary Kennedy in a contentious hearing on Capitol Hill today. A series of questions, not all of them were answered, with more tonight's political panel. Julie Rajinski, co-founder of Lift Our Voices, our Democratic strategist, alongside Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC communications director and Republican strategist, as well host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Great to have both of you with us for our conversation this evening. Lisa, I'm not really sure where to start with this one. There's a lot to unpack here. I'm just not sure if anything changed today. The Maha movement is still intact. RFK Jr. has his job. Was this just a chance for Democrats to do some yelling?
Yeah, I think the big disadvantage of what happened today is that the American people continue to be less and less informed about what the right direction is, about how they approach and how they take on their just choices for health care. This was not in any way something that people were paying close attention to. All of us here were breathlessly watching it because it is what we're watching. But I think the disadvantage in all of this is that we continue to have HHS and all of the other health agencies providing information that's confusing and misunderstood by the American people, and that's not making anybody healthy again.
Julie, weigh in here. What can Democrats do, the Democratic Party do, if anything?
Well, look, they can certainly bring attention to the complete catastrophe that is the Maha movement, and there's a lot to recommend some elements of this movement. I think we'd all like to get our kids to be eating healthier. I think we'd all like to get pesticides out of our food, but that's not what this is about. We now have a Secretary of Health and Human Services who is effectively overriding scientists and ensuring that our kids are going to be less safe, that diseases are going to spread that had once been effectively eradicated, and who will not answer just legitimate questions posed by both sides of the aisle and refuse to live up to the commitments that he made in order to get voted in to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Look, if this were anybody else in any other administration, Bobby Kennedy would never have been confirmed, but he certainly would be fired after this. But I fear that because he was so abrasive and he was so combative with senators who this president loathes, that this will actually recommend him to the president and will make the president double down on him, despite the fact that the president, look, you can say whatever you want about Donald Trump, but Operation Warp Speed was probably the most successful thing that he ever did as president. And when you have Bobby Kennedy effectively saying that the vaccine that this president turbocharged killed more people than it saved, that's a rebuke to Donald Trump. And that's something that should really be concerning, not just to Democrats, but it should be concerning to all Americans who relied on this vaccine to keep them safe during COVID, as well as so many other vaccines that keep all of us safe and have kept all of us safe for generations.
Well, I'll tell you, we're waiting for a ruling on Lisa Cook, meantime, to find out whether the Fed governor, who the president does want to fire, will be able to keep her job while a criminal investigation is underway. There's reporting from ProPublica that you've probably seen by now, Lisa, that 3 members of the president's administration, including the labor secretary, a couple of others, EPA, in fact, have similar allegations of mortgage fraud, if we call that fraud, with 2 mortgages claiming that both homes are a primary residence. Does this help Lisa Cook with her case, or do we have 3 new criminal investigations in the
No, I don't think either one of those things happen. I think the president's decided who he's going to fire. The president's going to fire Lisa Cook, and so we're going to go back and forth for a little while on this, and this is going to be one of the examples as to why she needs to go. She serves at the pleasure of the president, and she'll be on her way, and the other 3 will be ignored. And regardless of, look, I mean, I'm sitting here as the Republican spokesperson. Yeah. You're probably scratching your head wondering what in the world's happening. I mean, I agree with Julie Rajinski here. This is a party of one. This is an audience of one. It's what Donald Trump wants. And if his head of HHS goes to the Capitol Hill and insults the senators that he doesn't necessarily care about, the president's not going to care. And if Lisa Cook has done something that is consistent with what others have done in the administration, Donald Trump is not going to care. He's going to continue to do exactly what Donald Trump wants to do. And that's exactly what we can expect from him. So to expect any other playbook, I think, is actually misguided.
speaking of removals or potential removals, we got a report from the New York Times just a few minutes ago. I'll sum up the story for you and our global audience. That Mayor Eric Adams had told confidants that he would consider abandoning his re-election bid. This comes after, I believe, yesterday's reporting suggesting that Donald Trump has called Eric Adams, has called Curtis Sliwa as well, to really pave the way for a more unified and competitive approach to getting Mamdani out of the mayoral election. What do you make of something like that? From a Republican perspective, Donald Trump taking a Republican candidate out of the race.
I think Donald Trump wants to win. I think he wants his candidate to be in New York City because I think ultimately that's the audience he cares the most about. He always has. And so that to me is probably the signal that he wants to win. He wants to win New York. He wants New York to have a mayor that he has some say in how decisions are made and how work is going to go and how it's going to go for him and his legacy that he'll leave behind long after he's with us.
Mm-hmm. What's your thought on this, Julie? Will Eric Adams find a home at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as some of the reports suggest?
Well, Eric Adams knows he can't win this election, so Eric Adams has to make a decision as to whether he takes the job that's given to him now or whether he wants to wait until November and be out of a job altogether. Look, the problem here is for Donald Trump, I actually think what he wants most of all is to have Zohran Mamdani be the next mayor of New York, because what a great poster child for him to tie every Democrat to this man who he considers to be this abomination, democratic socialist. I don't think that Mamdani is quite the antichrist that he has painted him out to be. But for the base, of course, in the Republican Party, nothing is better than to have Zohran Mamdani as the whipping boy for the next several years. I will say for Andrew Cuomo, this is actually a very dangerous moment, because if there is any thought that he's working with this president to clear the field for himself of either Curtis Sliwa, the Republican nominee, or Eric Adams, and to establish himself as the anti-Mamdani candidate, which would obviously make him a lot stronger in a general election, that is going to get a lot of people who otherwise might look at Andrew Cuomo as a possibility to just vote no on him, to either stay home or even vote for Mamdani potentially, because nobody in New York City right now wants somebody who they think is cutting deals with Donald Trump. It is just anathema to voters in New York. I live here. I can tell you that firsthand.
Yeah.
So, if I were Andrew Cuomo, I'd be very careful about urging Trump to be doing what he's doing right now.
We have less than a minute. How's this going to play in New York? What do voters think of this?
I think voters have made up their mind.
Yeah.
I think that Mamdani will be the mayor of New York, and it's going to be interesting. Julie makes a great point. I mean, Andrew Cuomo, regardless of how people feel about him, making a deal with the guy who's in the White House is not the right move. So it certainly seems like this is the pathway it's going to go. They'll be playing behind the scenes for as long as we lead up into the election, but it seems like the decision in New York has already been made.
It's a fascinating moment. Thank you both for the insights. Julie Roginski, co-founder of Lift Our Voices, our Democratic strategist, and of course, Republican strategist Lisa Cabuso-Miller, the former RNC comms director. Thank you so much for both of you and your insights. Tune into the early edition of Balance of Power tomorrow. We'll be speaking with Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee. That'll be at 1:30 p.m. Wall Street time right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.